Good morning and very warm welcome here at the Stockholm School of Economics. Very warm welcome to all of you that follow us on Zoom as well. We had a small room today, so there was no place for everybody that wanted to come. But we're very, very happy for this big interest. My name is Maria Perrotta Berlin from the Stockholm Institute of Transition Economics site, and I have the honor to opening today's event and later to launch this project that is coming together after several months of research, collaboration, and hard work, the portal sanctions-russia.org. First, let me extend a sincere thank you to our partners and supporters who are here today, the Swedish Ministry for Foreign Affairs, who made this initiative possible, the Kiev School of Economics, our long-term collaborator partner, Corisk, whose expertise in data analysis and sanction compliance has been invaluable. And I also want to warmly thank the many researchers and experts with affiliations beyond this, who have contributed their time, insights, deep regional or topical expertise to this project. Your input has been fundamental and shaped both the structure and the substance of the portal, and we're truly grateful for your engagement. So why are we here today? Well, Russia's illegal war against Ukraine is still going on, with horrifying attacks day in and day out. Sanctions are one of the main instruments that the international community has used to respond to Russia's aggression. The one tool we have short of direct military intervention. So if this is the tool we've chosen, or at least the tool we are using, we need to know whether it actually is making a difference. But can we really know if sanctions are working? And perhaps more importantly, what does it even mean? So because sanctions are not like a switch that you flip and you expect an immediate result. The complex tools that work when they work through disruptions and delays and adaptations and countermeasures and so on. So their effects ripple through economies, through institutions, through supply chains, and can be hard to trace. But that doesn't mean we shouldn't try. In fact, understanding the impact of sanctions is more important than ever, because the alternative is to let the debate be dominated by clickbait, ideology, or fatigue, and that's dangerous. Sanctions are also often difficult to evaluate, also because they take time. Take time to see the effect, but doesn't mean nothing is happening. It just means we need better tool to observe, to interpret, and communicating what's unfolding, especially when the outcomes are slow, complex, or deliberately obscured. So there are many reasons why sanctions are hard to evaluate. Often they may not have a single clear objective. Sometimes they're meant to deter an action before it happens. Sometimes they're used to coerce a change in behavior once it has happened after the fact. And sometimes the purpose is mostly symbolic, just to signal disapproval, to draw a line, to uphold international norms. But that means that success is not one thing. It's not always a matter of whether sanctions work or didn't work. And then there are analytical challenges. How do we measure impact? We often lack the kind of clear data that we would need to draw strong conclusions. Even more as we are now in the fog of war, when even statistics and information are used for propaganda purposes. And even when we do have good data, there's always the challenge of the counterfactual. What would have happened if the sanctions hadn't been imposed? Would Russia's military production be higher? Would revenues be flowing more freely? Would the war be going differently? These are not questions we can answer by looking at one number in a spreadsheet. They require context, judgment, and caution. It's more like putting together a jigsaw puzzle than tracing a straight line from a cause to an effect. It's more than writing or reading a headline. But in today's fast-paced media environment, policy debates often risk being shaped by headlines, snap judgments that reflect noise, wishful thinking, or the need for a clear story when the reality is far more complex. And that opens the door to two equally dangerous narratives. Either sanctions are clearly working, so nothing more needs to be done, or sanctions are clearly failing, so we can as well give up. Both are wrong, and both can lead to bad decisions. That's why this portal exists. Ask better questions. Questions like, what parts of the Russian economy are still resilient and why? Where are the real choke points? Which countries are fully aligned and which are letting goods slip through? These questions will be hear more about today, thanks to our esteemed guests. Very soon. Our hope with this portal then is to bring together serious research, reliable data, and transparent methods in one place. Because if sanctions are going to remain a cornerstone of the international response, then understanding how they work and where they fall short is not optional, it's essential. Of course, an initiative like this doesn't exist in a vacuum. It requires not only analytical rigor, but also the political commitment to ask hard questions and act on the answers. Because if it's true that without serious research, policy risks drifting under pressure from competing narratives, it's also true that without political commitment, research has no traction. Therefore, we're once again very grateful for the support and engagement of the Swedish Minister for Foreign Affairs throughout the project. And I'm especially pleased to welcome Anna Eksted from the Sanctions Coordinator at the Ministry to share a few opening remarks. Very welcome.
Good morning, everybody, colleagues and friends. Let me begin by expressing my sincere thanks to the Stockholm School of Economics and a special thanks to Assistant Professor Maria Perrotta-Berlin and also to Director Torbjörn Becker here at the Stockholm Institute of Transition Economics for the kind invitation to be here today to say a few opening words. The launch of sanctionsrussia.org marks indeed a significant step forward in our collective efforts to better understand the impact of sanctions. As Maria was saying here, it's indeed important for us to understand the effect of sanctions and also in order for us to be able to assess whether our restrictive measures are achieving their intended goals. This portal has the potential indeed to serve as a vital resource to enhance transparency and also foster informed debate and support evidence-based policy making in this field, and also with that enhance implementation of the sanctions. In order for us for the sanctions to work, they of course need to be not only well designed, but also effectively implemented and enforced. The Swedish Ministry for Foreign Affairs is proud to be here today to support this initiative. We see great value in this portal and the mission for it to serve as a knowledge hub on sanctions, promoting both outreach and collaboration between research, academia, and also with operative workers in this field. We do need a deeper insight to this quite difficult instrument of international diplomacy. It is complex to work with sanctions and implement sanctions. The pressure on Russia must continue to increase, including through tightened and additional sanctions, particularly targeting the energy sector and the so-called also shadow fleet. Increasing pressure is the best incentive for Russia to engage in negotiations and to create the conditions for lasting peace. The economy is Russia's weak point at the moment. Inflation is high, growth is weak, and foreign investors are avoiding the Russian market. Together with support to Ukraine, sanctions are Sweden's and the EU's most important tool to counter Russia and limit its ability to finance the war. To maximize impact, sanctions must target the core sectors of the Russian economy, which are driven by oil and gas revenues. Therefore, sanctions against the Russian shadow fleet in the Baltic Sea are a high priority for Sweden, and we are working on several fronts together with the Nordic Baltic countries, within the EU and with partners, to push also the European Commission to advocate for a lower oil price cap within the G7, and for the EU to sanction more vessels and other key actors. Sweden continues to lead efforts to further tighten measures against vessels in the shadow fleet, which are used to circumvent EU sanctions and the G7 oil price cap. Ukraine has shown that it seeks an immediate and unconditional ceasefire. The EU's role in this situation is to strengthen Ukraine and to increase pressure on Russia to achieve a ceasefire. Supporting Ukraine in the fight against Russian aggression is Sweden's top foreign policy priority. Our support is unwavering. Our focus is to ensure that Ukraine is in a position of strength. To achieve that, our number one priority is to maximize support now and also long term. During 2025, we have presented our largest military and civilian support package to Ukraine so far. The latest military package amounted to 1.4 billion euros. And the main part of the civilian package is a 90 million euro top-up of the Ukrainian facility to support Ukrainian reconstruction and recovery. Only this year we have budgeted for 2025 to have at least 700 million euros, which is approximately 14% of Sweden's global aid budget for 2025. Implementation and enforcement of sanctions against Russia are, of course, crucial. We do see that the sanctions do have an effect. Despite the narratives on the contrary, the impact is visible both economically and on the battlefield. Russia is being forced to pay significantly more to acquire the goods and technologies that they need. This is a clear indication that our sanctions are working. And today we will soon hear more from Torbjörn on the findings from the report Financing the Russian War Economy, which will provide us with more evidence on the effects of the sanctions, but we'll also hear more on the challenges as well on the implementation from other experts here today. But it's clear that we need to challenge the Russian narrative and be clear that the sanctions are effective, or the fact that the claims that sanctions are ineffective are indeed false. The Russian economy is under strain and supply chains are disrupted and the costs are rising for Russia and the battlefield consequences are real. However, evasion and circumvention, of course, remains a serious challenge. We must do much more here, collectively and also decisively, to prevent and enforce against it. Prevention and outreach is indeed crucial in this work. We need to engage with the private sector and support the private sector. We see that small and medium enterprises need support in order to interpret and implement the sanctions regimes. We should not underestimate the strain it can cause on the private sector to implement the sanctions regime. The EU has now presented 17 packages that are broad and span over big sectorial sections. We should not underestimate the fact that it can be difficult to implement them and work closely with the private sector and inform each other. And events like this is very important for this. And enforcement, of course, our government has tasked 9 national competent authorities to set up a cooperation mechanism on sanctions implementation, and this is led by the police. And this initiative aims specifically at strengthening pre-investigations and also enhanced prosecutions when we do see that sanctions crime are being committed. and also enhance coordination across the agencies and enhance information sharing on sanctions, and ensure accountability when we see that there are violations of the sanctions. We also have new legislative measures in place since last week, was it? 10th of June, we have a new legislation in order to transpose the new EU directive on sanctions. The penalty levels in Sweden have now been raised. And we also, the law will equip the law enforcement with more tools in order to conduct investigations. And it will also be easier and obligation for authorities to report crimes to the police when they see potential circumvention or infringement. Outreach and collaboration are indeed important. We need to foster information sharing between the different actors from private sector and policymakers and academia. And a multi-stakeholder approach is clearly needed here. These sanctions have existed for long. I mean, we are talking here today about the Russia sanctions. Sweden are following, we have 48 different regimes that we are bound by and that we are implementing. But the Russia regimes are indeed very encompassing and difficult to interpret in certain times. So we need to work together on that also, ahead. I am keen, of course, now to hear from all of you, all the experts here today, on how we can further enhance our joint efforts. I'm very much looking forward also to using this portal that I see can be a vital tool ahead in our collective response. So thank you once again for this opportunity to be part of this launch event, and we look forward to working closely with you in the progress of this initiative and continued cooperation to ensure peace and security. Thank you.
Okay, so but first, Torbjörn, the floor is yours.
Thank you, Maria. And thank you everyone for being here. Thank you to the ministry for the good collaboration on developing this platform. Thanks to our speakers that have been providing so much important input to this process. I'm going to share with you something that is a little bit maybe on the side of sanctions as such, but it's really why we're discussing sanctions at the end of the day. So it is about the Russian economy. How do we think the Russian economy is doing today? What have been the consequences of financing the Russian war machine? Why should we be talking about sanctions, and what type of sanctions do we think are important today, given what we're seeing in this type of analysis? This is based on a report that we wrote for the Swedish government. I was at the ECOFIN meeting in Brussels because our finance minister thought that was important to have this discussion with all of the finance ministers of the EU. So I'm going to give you sort of a quick run through, similar to what I did in Brussels. But again, I hope we can have some questions and comments, and maybe at the end, as Maria said. But just a reminder, this is about what is going on in the Russian economy, not only as a consequence of sanctions, but also as a consequence of the bad choices the Russian government is doing all by itself, and then trying to understand how this has implications for the type of sanctions that we should be looking at more closely. And I think we'll post this online, so you have a link also to the report on this slide here. All right, so a couple of questions to ask ourselves. The first is a pretty simple one, but still it gets a lot of confused answers. Is the Russian economy strong compared to the EU and the West? It's quite simple. The answer is no, it's not. It's not an economic superpower. The West combined is at least 20 times the size of the Russian economy. So in an economic war of attrition, we would be certain to win if we just use that economic power in a good way. Then what is going on in the Russian economy? It's still oil and gas being the most important drivers for the Russian economy. It's clear that fiscal and monetary policy are not in sync. Inflation is quite likely much higher than what the official numbers show. This also then has implications for what we think is the real GDP growth that Russia is telling us about. But coming from that, we cannot sit around and think that the Russian economy will just collapse by itself and this will end the war. So when people say, you know, how long can this go on? You know, how long can the Russian economy survive? My answer is always, it depends. And very specifically, it depends on what we do to make sure that they don't have the resources to continue this war. And that really comes back to the whole sanctions discussion here today. However, we of course can see that there are increasing imbalances in the Russian economy. I'll get back to that. And then, of course, we have the big question at the end, what should the EU and the West do? And again, Ukraine certainly cannot sit around and wait for the Russian economy to implode itself in 5 years or so. So we have to speed up that process. We have to help Ukraine win this war within a reasonable time frame. And that's about limiting the resources available to Russia. And as we're going to get back to over and over again, it's going to be sanctions on oil and gas, but it's also putting increasing pressure on the financial sector in Russia. As we all know, banking and financial crises, when they happen, are extremely disruptive, very complicated to deal with, and have pretty serious consequences for the rest of the economy. So I think there's more work to actually be done also on the financial sector side. And then last on this thing, it is, of course, a matter of two parties fighting this war. So it's about the relative strength between Russia and Ukraine. And of course, as much as we try to minimize the incomes of the Russian economy, we want to make sure that we increase the resources available to Ukraine. It's part of the same picture. So let's not have separate discussions about sanctioning Russia, supporting Ukraine, or actually even now building up the military in the West and getting to a 5% level. It's all part of the same package. And we're having all of these discussions for one single reason, which is Russia's illegal war in Ukraine. So we have to be able to have all of these three things in our heads at the same time, because it's about what are the alternative costs of different policies. So sanctions is one part of this puzzle. Support to Ukraine is another. Getting the frozen assets to Ukraine, in my mind, is really our low-cost option of making sure that we can end this war. It's no doubt about this. And I've been in so many discussions now. I just came back from Warsaw at the Security Forum in Warsaw. Several speakers came back to this point, and I cannot stress silver bullet right here and now. It really is to create a 200 or 300 billion US dollar fund for Ukraine, for them to buy the weapons they need, for them to make sure their economy is working during this stressful time period. And I think it would be a wonderful, sense of instant karma that we use the Russian assets to actually strengthen Ukraine and to win the war against Russia. They thought they were building a war chest in Russia. If we now transfer that to Ukraine, I just think that would be really something fantastic to do. And it really is the right way to go. So this is just Russia not being a great power. We can measure, of course, GDPs in market exchange rates, or we can do it in purchasing power parities. It doesn't really matter. This is Russia. Yes, it's bigger than Sweden. It's bigger than Ukraine. But if you look at the Western partners on that side of the chart, Russia is tiny. People then say, well, what about China? China is sort of on Russia's side. My only comment to that is, indeed, China is buying cheap energy nowadays from Russia, subsidized because of sanctions. They're selling expensive inputs to the war machine, again, because of sanctions, so Russia cannot get it as cheaply as they would otherwise. So China is, of course, a facilitator of Russia's aggression against Ukraine, but it's not really an economic partner in the sense of providing financial support to Russia. China is making money out of Russia's current situation and their needs. So, let's not confuse partnerships with the countries that want to benefit from what's going on here. So that's why, again, Russia, even with China on its side, it's not really comparable in economic terms to Ukraine and Ukraine's Western partners. And why are we always talking about oil and gas and energy when we talk about sanctions? This is basically a chart that gives you the fundamentals of the Russian economy. At the end here, we have oil and GDP. And note that in this chart, it's oil prices and what happens to Russia's GDP over time. We have some good economists in the room. They would complain that these series are non-stationary. I can promise you we can do it properly statistically and still have a correlation which is 60 to 70% of Russia's growth rates being explained by what happens to the oil price up or down. So, that's really the foundations of why we should think about sanctioning oil, and in particular, reducing the price that Russia gets paid for its oil to the lowest possible point. That will certainly have an effect on the Russian economy. And this is not something we need to base on current official statistics. This is a relationship that's been there since the fall of the Soviet Union. This is a relationship that Russia has tried to come out of for like 30 years and never succeeded to do. So, let's not think that all of a sudden this structure has changed. And Maria is looking a little bit worried on her watch, and I'll not going to get into too much of this. Yeah. Yes. But then, the other things here, if we look at what happens to the ruble exchange rate and oil prices, also very strong correlation. It's a bit messy to see here because when oil prices have been falling very dramatically, Russia was actually forced off the peg to have a floating exchange rate, which is why the first part of the chart doesn't look so impressive in terms of correlations. But it's basically that the story then is that when the oil price went up, you can actually have a peg, but when the oil price drops, that peg is no longer sustainable. And then you have a very strong correlation. And then, we have these other events at the end that makes, again, the picture a bit more messy. And of course, the Russian stock market and oil prices, again, very, very strong correlation. So this is basically why we need to focus on pushing down the price Russia gets paid for its oil. The other thing is that this war is not cheap for Russia. But if you look at the official statistic, it looks like the deficits, the gray bars over there, are actually not that bad in that fiscal picture. If you deduct the oil and gas revenue, you get the non-oil and gas deficit, and you can see that if we were to limit the incomes again on oil and gas, they would have enormous deficits. Again, just making the point, limit the revenues on oil and gas to make sure that we limit the resources of the Russian war machine. The other thing, though, is that, well, that looks like there's not that much fiscal stimulus maybe in the Russian economy from the war if you look at that deficit number. But if you then look at what happens on the monetary side, you can see how inflation has taken off, but much more importantly, how the policy rate, this red line, has really skyrocketed. I mean, they now decreased it from 21 to 20%. Our central bank today, if I'm not mistaken, lowered our policy rate to 2%. So do we seriously think that they have an inflation rate of 10 and a policy rate of 20? That would have implied a real interest rate of 10% or even more than 10% if you look at what companies and individuals actually can borrow at. I mean, that would be quite inconceivable in any other country than Russia. So this to me is a sign that, yeah, inflation can be 10% in the official statistics. It may be something else if we look more closely. In our previous report in the fall on the Russian economy, we included an index from a company called Romir in Russia that make an independent survey of the Russian economy. They basically had at least twice the inflation rates of the official statistics. And just by a coincidence, after we published the report a month or so later, they stopped publishing these alternative inflation measures. Not only they stopped publishing new numbers, they also took out the old numbers that they used to have on their webpage. So I think when we get back to this discussion about war propaganda, what numbers can we trust, etc., to me that's a pretty good indication that we shouldn't really trust all of the stuff coming out from the Russian authorities today. The other thing about this war effort is, of course, that you have to finance this war in one way or the other. One big deal here is the National Wealth Fund. That was actually supposed to safeguard pensions of Russian households and old people. They have now basically wasted this resource for the Russian population on fighting this illegal war against Ukraine. They have been drawing down of these reserves. The last statistics, the liquid parts of this reserves is now below 3% of GDP. It's basically gold and yuan that are still the liquid parts of this reserve fund. A lot of the other stuff they cannot really use in the fund to finance the war. So it basically means that if they run a deficit that is over 3% in this year, they will need to have a different mechanism to finance the war than sort of taking out of their piggy bank and using up the liquid parts of that. And then, of course, what are the other ways for a government to finance its budgets? It's basically borrowing in markets. So one thing here, though, is that borrowing, if you do it domestically, you basically reduce demand in the rest of the economy. It's going to have consequences. And so OFC is basically the domestic bonds in Russia. And it used to be the case that foreign investors, this line, was a significant local bonds. And that share has basically gone to nothing at the end of this period. So Russia will have a very hard time to mobilize financing from foreign sources, both in their domestic market or in international markets. And this is clearly a constraint on what they can do going forward. So then we move over to the financial sector. The Kiev School of Economics, Craig Kennedy, they have all done important work on looking at, what's going on in the military-industrial complex and how is this funded through the banking system in Russia. So one of the things that Craig puts up in his report is that the lending from banks to the military-industrial complex is several $100 billion worth of lending. And these things are not done on a market-based condition. It's subsidized loans with unclear repayment schedules, etc. And we know from history that when the government has previously had these programs to fund the military-industrial complex, it ends up with the government having to bail out the banks or the military-industrial complex. So right now, that type of funding would have doubled the fiscal deficits in Russia if it had gone through the state budget. So that's kind of important to remember. So what is this doing to the financial sector in Russia? It's basically helping to build up risks and vulnerabilities in the financial sector. So these are some indicators that people use when they predict banking crisis. And basically all of the indicators we can find for Russia is pointing to increasing risks of a banking crisis. It doesn't mean that we know that the crisis is going to happen tomorrow, in a year. The only thing, unfortunately, we economists can say the risk of a crisis is increasing. But, you know, never take an economist seriously when he says, I know there's going to be a crisis tomorrow. 99.9% of the time, they're wrong. So, you know, but we do know that on average, these are important risk factors. And one thing, you may think that the fact that people are putting money into deposits in the banks is a good sign. It's a sign that they have a ridiculously high interest rate. So people go and put money into the banks. But as they put in money into the banks, the moment people lose confidence that banks can actually let them withdraw funds, they will have a bank run. This is one of the classical mechanisms of how do you get a bank run. It's when people have been lured into putting money into banks with very high interest rates, and then the confidence of the banks fail and people want to get their money out. That's, you know, a classical bank run scenario. All right. So two principles when we discuss these things, and which is why sanctions are important. This is that also autocratic states have budget constraints. So we want to hit the Russian budget constraint on both sides. We want to make sure that we reduce the revenues that comes into the government and to Russia as a country by reducing incomes primarily on oil and gas. On the other side, we want to make the stuff that they need to buy from other countries more expensive, which is again why we have sanctions on trade with Russia. So we increase the cost and we reduce the revenues. That makes the budget constraint tighter. It means that instead of producing maybe 100 robots, they can produce 70 or 50. So again, we have to remind ourselves, this is not a 0-1 game. But every robot that Russia cannot fire on Ukraine is to the benefit of Ukraine. So, you know, we have to have a realistic ambition when it comes to sanction. But any dollar or euro or yuan that we can prevent going to produce more rockets for Russia, you know, that's a good thing. So we have to have that in mind. And again, I already said this. The other part of this equation is to provide significant and predictable support to Ukraine. With the current US administration, we know that's not going to be coming from the US. It means that Europe has to take the lead. With the debt to GDP ratios of European government, it also means that the only realistic way of providing this at a significant level here and now is to use the frozen Russian assets, make a 200-300 billion fund out of this, and basically finance Ukraine, not for a month or a week or a year, but maybe for 3 to 5 years. That would make certain that Russia will not win the economic war of attrition that is also going on now. And then there's also a bunch of papers from the International Working Group on Russian sanctions that we are all involved in different circles. And then, of course, we're going to have a lot of more interesting papers on the portal, and we'll hear from Ben, we'll hear from Erlend how to actually do sanctions. So I'll stop here. Thank you.
Can wait here. We have more time for discussion later, but let's see if there's one or two burning questions already here for Torbjörn.
All right. Burning is a particular word these days.
Burning. Thanks. My name is Eric Meyerson. I work for SEB. Thanks very much for the presentation. You know, we're right in the middle of a new war in the Middle East, Israel against Iran, and so Iran has also been subject to severe sanctions, possibly even more severe sanctions than Russia. And I think one consensus among analysts is that the sanctions on Iran have exerted a lot of economic damage, increased poverty, reduced Iran's incomes, and so on. But it hasn't really affected their ability to project power in the Middle East. And so what we're seeing now, or you know, what we started seeing last year, is finally an action that is curtailing Iran's power, but it tended to be military. So I think this is something that I wanted to hear your thoughts about. You know, there's the issue where we're kind of hoping for tougher sanctions, and we're kind of if only. And there's the whole issue of, you know, what do we mean by sanctions? Do we mean bilateral sanctions? Do we mean secondary sanctions? But then there's also the issue, suppose we do impose tougher sanctions and that doesn't work. You know, that then raises the issue of military. So I that's just a point that I wanted to hear you talk a little bit about.
Yeah, I mean, I think the very basic answer is, again, it's a package deal. It's about sanctioning Russia and strengthening Ukraine. It's part of the same sort of motivation here. We want Ukraine to win the war. And the thing is that imagine a case where Iran had unlimited funds. Would they have nukes today? How much money would they have sent to the different groups in the Middle East in this time? So I think, you know, we may think that the ultimate goal for all of these sanctions is regime change. As an economist, I'm a little bit more modest and say, I just want to make their budget constraint as tight as possible, because it matters if you produce 50 tanks or 5 tanks. So, you know, again, with Russia, it really is about limiting how much they can produce at the same time as we make sure that Ukraine has the weapons to defend themselves for whatever stuff Russia actually managed to produce. So I think, you know, this is always, in my mind, you know, it's about relative strengths. It's not one side being weak compared to what, you know, it really has to be this balance of power that we want to change.
Thank you, Torbjörn. My name is Fredrik Löfqvist, Director of Stockholm Center of Eastern European Studies. My question regards the sort of the ones who are sanctioning and the agency of sanctioning and the coordination. We are still not there, but we may face challenges with EU sort of producing new sanctions because of lacking consensus. We don't know where the US is going on this. Are constellations, national sanctions regimes, how can we use G7 and countries outside and so forth? You could elaborate a little bit, not only to keep up the existing sanctions pressure, but ideally also how to strengthen it. But what are sort of the political decision-making constraints on that?
All right, only easy questions today. Thank you. No, but I think, you know, you already said the magic word here, G7. G7 is the group that has decided on the oil price cap. At $60, we want to push it down to 45, more usefully down to 30 or something like that, I would say. So I think, you know, that work has to be done there. And again, oil is the key revenue source for Russia still. So I say G7 definitely. But again, I think we are also in Europe always bashing ourselves. there is a new sanctions package coming out of the EU, so I think we should be quite happy about that, at least for now. Then again, as some people said in Warsaw, why do we have all these sanction packages? Why didn't we have one big package in the beginning, and maybe things would have looked differently? So, you know, so my criticism against the EU is maybe that it's taking a bit too long to get all the way to where we want to be. But certainly G7 now would be one important, you know, constellation of players pushing down oil revenues to Russia. So that would be probably the quick answer.
Thank you again. Let's welcome to the stage Ben Hilgenstock now.
Thank you very much. First and foremost, thanks to the Stockholm School of Economics and to SITE for organizing this event and for inviting me, or rather KC Institute. Very happy to present a couple of thoughts on the way forward on sanctions here. What I don't want to do in my presentation is to deliver some kind of laundry list of measures. Instead, I want to focus on next priorities, in particular, given the fact that we may be operating with our sanctions regime in a somewhat different world in terms of geopolitical circumstances. And I want to talk about contingency planning. We often speak of third countries when it comes to sanctions. What if the United States becomes a third country? So first of all, on the state of play and next steps. As Torbjörn has already pointed out, Russia is in a quite vulnerable position. The budget deficit over the first 5 months of the year was 3.4 trillion rubles. That's 3 times the deficit that Russia had in January-May 2024. So the situation has changed quite a bit here. Torbjörn also talked about the liquid assets of the National Welfare Fund. As of end of May, they stood at 2.8 trillion. That's a 71% decline in liquid assets since the start of the full-scale invasion. And as Torbjörn pointed out, it is essentially yuan and gold left in the National Welfare Fund. And for the first time in a very long time, Russia's projected budget deficit for this year is larger than the remaining funds in the liquid portion of the NWF. And then again, as Torbjörn has also pointed out, headline inflation is still elevated above 10% basically for all of 2025. And the CBR struggles quite a bit to get inflation down despite significant monetary tightening. So the key to changing Vladimir Putin's calculus is energy, and this is what I want to focus on in the first part of my presentation. For the time being, it doesn't seem like there's any incentive for Putin or Russia to come to the negotiating table. We see that in terms of the delegations that are sent to Turkey or elsewhere. We see that also in the kind of opening statements and demands that are made. When it comes to these negotiations, energy is really key to change this. For now, Putin seems to think the longer he waits, the better the situation gets for him. We have to change this calculus, and this works via reducing export earnings and budget revenues from oil and gas. Oil and gas accounted for more than half of Russia's total export earnings in 2024 and about 30% of total budget revenues. So any change here would really make a big difference. Now to the kind of elephant in the room and the big question, have energy sanctions had an impact? Yes, they have. We estimate that Russia has lost about $100 billion in oil and gas export earnings from the start of the price cap and the EU embargo on Russian oil in December 2022. This includes April. But unfortunately, there's the other side of the coin, which is, have we done enough? And unfortunately, the answer here is also a very unequivocal no. So in 2024, this should say, not 25, Russia earned $235 billion from exports of oil and gas. This is essentially unchanged, as you can see here, to 2023. It's a little less than in 2021. It's basically the same as in 2019. The only 2 years this doesn't apply to are 2022, when prices for energy were going through the roof, and 2020, when we had a global pandemic. So have we done enough? Clearly, no. When various European leaders traveled to Kiev a couple of weeks ago, they talked about massive new sanctions. And if we take that as a benchmark and look at the 18th sanctions package that is currently being discussed, then the question is what we're doing in the 18th package massive new sanctions? And the answer is unfortunately no. There is a discussion about European sanctions on Nord Stream 1 and 2. As a German, I welcome this very much. It takes a very problematic topic off the table for good. We have seen some grotesque rumors in recent weeks and months about getting Nord Stream 1 and 2 back into operations, and some very problematic creatures have been crawling out from under some rocks here. So this is very welcome, but it would have zero immediate impact on Russia because there's no gas flowing through these pipelines. So medium, long term, yes. For now, additional pressure, no. On the oil price cap, I am extremely skeptical about the impact of a lower cap on Russian oil, and I'll talk about this a little later why that is. It's very encouraging to see additional listings of Russian shadow tankers. The EU has done quite a lot of these by now. There is an enforcement challenge with this. I'll get back to this. And then there is a discussion about a ban on refined products, which is something that various NGOs have been talking about as the so-called refining loophole. Basically, Russian crude oil gets refined in third countries and then comes back to coalition countries, including the EU, UK, and others. There's an enforcement challenge associated with this as well, because it's very difficult to prove where an oil product ultimately came from and if it was made from Russian oil or not. Okay, so how to step up pressure on Russia? First of all, there's the question of doing our own homework. Europe continues to import significant amounts of Russian oil and gas and pays significant amounts of money for that, basically into Vladimir Putin's war chest. These are numbers from our friends at CREA from 2024. The European Union imported Russian crude oil worth $4.9 billion, pipeline gas worth $9.6 billion, LNG worth $7.5 billion, and as you know, with increasing quantities. And then there are products made from Russian oil. This is just a rough estimate from CREA, but the amount would be roughly 4.1 billion euros here. So that's more than 20 billion euros just from the first three items, which are pretty clear that we're still paying to Russia for oil and gas. And this is really rather unnecessary. CREA's fossil fuel tracker shows that since February 2022, EU countries have paid more than 200 billion euros for Russian oil and gas, and that's 26% of Russia's total earnings here. So this is for... I really want to emphasize this. Either we fix this system or we abandon it. I would say that the price cap right now has no impact on Russian export earnings, that it hasn't had an impact on Russian export earnings for quite some time, and that it actually never had an impact on Russian export earnings. That it was the EU embargo in the first half of 2023 that really drove down prices for Russian oil and really cut Russian export earnings from oil and budget revenues from oil, but that it was not the price cap. Without addressing issues with price cap compliance, lower caps are basically meaningless. And I'm worried about the political capital that we're investing into this question. Issues about getting the US on board with a lower price cap, leaving that aside. The problem with the price cap is the attestation system. We're basically we're relying for our assessment of price cap compliance and for our enforcement against price cap violators for information that is completely unreliable. The price cap is enforced on so-called FOB prices, free on board or origin port prices, And the only entities that have pricing information at that point are the Russian buyer, which is a Russian oil company, and the seller, and the buyer, which is a subsidiary of a Russian oil company sitting in Dubai, or some other questionable entity that is suspected to be linked to Russian interests, that basically popped up in late 2022, early 2023, and took over the entire Russian oil trade. Until we address the attestation fraud issue, which has been known since early 2023, a lower price cap will not do very much. This subsidiary of a Russian oil company, say Litasco, instead of writing on a piece of paper that the oil was sold at $60 a barrel, will just say it was sold at $45 a barrel or at $30 a barrel. Which also brings us to the question of shadow tanker sanctions. The price cap can only be efficient if enough oil is transported on ships that have to comply with the price cap. Currently, about 75% of Russian crude oil is transported with shadow tankers. So here, there's just no leverage for the cap. And again, the EU and other allies have done quite a lot in terms of sanctions on shadow tankers, listings specifically, but they need to be enforced. And we have unfortunately seen that EU and UK tanker designations are less effective than US designations because we do not employ the threat of secondary sanctions. I'll talk about this a little bit later in the second part of the presentation. Now, I said at the beginning that we're operating in a bit of a different geopolitical environment. Before, the sanctions regime was about creating medium-term pressure on Russia and make it harder for Russia, as Torbjörn pointed out, to pay for this war and conduct this war. Now, with the Trump administration very interested in some kind of quick settlement, whatever you want to call it, we may have to talk about different measures. We may need to be looking at measures that bring Vladimir Putin to the negotiating table quickly. If we want to do that, we may have to talk about actually reducing Russian export volumes from oil and gas. The question then is how this is enforced. There's talk in the US Congress about a bill that would use tariffs as an enforcement mechanism. I believe that is entirely non-credible. Secondary sanctions, so threats against the buyers of Russian oil in third countries, would be more effective. But importantly, US buy-in would be importantly needed for reaching third countries here. And we could employ some kind of gradual approach to protect energy markets, not removing all Russian oil and gas from the market in one go, but rather go step by step, go by terminal, target gas first, then target oil, and create an incentive structure for Russia to actually come to the negotiating table. Now, briefly on the cost of failure, I know everyone, this is preaching to the choir here. Everyone is aware of this. So every day that this war continues, more lives are lost, more assets are destroyed, the recovery is delayed. But importantly, this is also going to cost money. It's going to cost us money. At KSC Institute, we're currently updating our macro forecast for Ukraine. And importantly, we're going to shift our assumption of an end to the war before the end of 2025 to the end of 2026. What that does basically immediately is create a very large fiscal financing gap, maybe up to $20 billion, because Ukraine will not be able to reduce defense spending. Revenues will continue to underperform or perform less well. And there's no way, basically, it's tough to say this, but there's no way to make up these revenues domestically or cut it out of the budget somewhere else. And there are conversations already going on about stage 2 of the IRA loan system. And I think this is, if the war continues deep into 2026, an inevitable conversation that we need to have. Now, I want to talk about this very joyful topic of maintaining sanctions without the United States. I'm going to show you a bunch of individual measures, and I'll try to color code them. So green, and I should say first as a caveat, like these ratings are debatable. We're trying to assess this, but of course there's a conversation to be had about each one of them. So green will say that sanctions had a limited impact in the past, and so the US stepping back from the sanctions regime will not have terrible consequences. Yellow means that the US does not play a key role for the functioning of the sanctions regime, or rather that other partners play a key role for the effectiveness of sanctions in certain areas. Then there's orange, where we think that backtracking from the US side could be partially offset with additional action by partners. And then there is red. These are measures or enforcement systems where it will be very difficult for partners to offset an exit of the United States from the sanctions coalition. So I'll briefly look at these 4 areas: energy, export controls, financial sanctions, and other restrictions, depending on how this is going with time. Happy to get into details afterwards in the Q&A. So first, on the oil price cap, I'm coding the screen, or we're coding the screen, because again, the oil price cap never worked, and it doesn't work right now. So this is about the current oil price cap. If the US steps back from the oil price cap, this may have a bit of an effect on the risk perception of everyone involved in this business, and it may reduce the discount on Russian oil a little bit, but it's not a fundamentally huge problem. Not because the US is not important, just because the system isn't working anyways. Then there are import bans on Russian energy. This is really what hit Russia hard, in particular in the first half of 2023, when Russia had to find new buyers after the EU and the UK imposed their respective embargoes. And it led to serious discounts up to $35, $40 a barrel for crude oil for several months. Important here is the US was very early with import bans on Russian energy, but it wasn't really buying any of it anyway. It is Europe that decides whether we continue to buy Russian oil and gas, whether we increase our purchases of Russian gas, whether we reduce them. So we're kind of in the driver's seat here. Similar situation for Nord Stream 2. And as I mentioned, there is a discussion underway in Brussels and in European capitals about sanctioning Nord Stream 2. This would be a very welcome backstop to the US measures. But even without EU sanctions on Nord Stream 2, there are several roadblocks here. First of all, the pipelines are damaged and would need to be repaired. Second, Nord Stream 2 is not certified in Germany, so this would require an active act by the German government rather than just passively standing back. There's also a multi-billion judgment from Uniper, which had to be bailed out by the German government to the tune of 50 billion euros or so. Against Gazprom, this would have to be paid first, or we would have to waive it before we could even start thinking about purchasing gas through Nord Stream 2 again. And then, of course, there are the geopolitical questions or questions of relationship between Germany and its Central and Eastern European allies here. On LNG, this is a bit more difficult. US sanctions on Russian LNG facilities and tankers have been quite effective, in particular on Arctic LNG 2, which was supposed to enter operations and hasn't really, because the US imposed sanctions and clearly specified that there was a secondary sanctions threat associated with this. Were these sanctions being withdrawn, other countries around the world could buy more Russian LNG, including from Arctic LNG 2. But if I'm not mistaken, roughly 70% of Russian LNG in 2024 was sold to either the EU or Japan and a couple other countries. So if we stopped importing in case of the US removing sanctions on Arctic LNG 2 and other terminals. The shadow tanker designations issue is a key one. So again, the EU has done a lot here. The problem is that we see that a much higher share of EU-sanctioned shadow tankers continue to operate. And this is not surprising whatsoever. In the case of US listings or OFAC listings, there is a threat of secondary sanctions that is kind of out there in a very vague form. So everyone interacting with these vessels or the cargo that they carry, Indian refineries, Chinese port authorities, UAE-based banks, they have to assess where the red line is and how not to cross it. In the case of EU and UK designation, this threat simply doesn't exist. And for the effectiveness of our shadow tanker designations and the credibility of this strategy, we have to figure out how to enforce them. So were the US stepping back from this right now, and without further action on our side on enforcement, this would be very difficult to offset. Restrictions on technology and investments in the Russian energy sector. These restrictions to an extent have been around since 2014. A lot of the players here are from the US in terms of oil and gas field technology and software provision. Were the US withdrawing these restrictions, it would be relatively difficult for us to make sure that these companies wouldn't re-enter the Russian market. It wouldn't have an effect right away, but it would significantly improve the medium and long-term prospects of the Russian energy industry, which is not something that we want. On export controls, the picture actually looks rather bad, so please expect a lot of red here. So first on the controls, we know from the trade data, at least until it stopped existing at the end of 2023, Russian customs data that is, and from the findings in Russian weapons in Ukraine, that US producers account for a very large share of Western components that are still traded to Russia and still found in Russian weapons. So were the US withdrawing its export controls here, this would be a problem. It would make it easier for Russia and significantly cheaper to acquire these goods. The other issue is that US export controls are very far-reaching via the foreign direct product rule, and US exiting this sanctions regime may actually mean that export controls on the goods of European companies produced in third countries would be weakened as well. And since our export controls don't have this extraterritorial application, and there's still carve-outs for joint ventures of European companies in third countries, or just production by contractual partners, this would create a significant hole in the sanctions regime. It doesn't look much better on the enforcement side. One of the most important things that anyone has done with regard to sanctions is President Biden's executive order from December 2023, which threatened third country financial institutions with disconnection from the US financial system and US dollar if they continue to trade war-critical goods to Russia. Even in countries that are not super happy with our sanctions regime, this has led to huge hesitancy, huge delays, and a further increase in the markups that Russia has to pay for these goods. Currently, because our sanctions enforcement isn't extraterritorial, we do not really have anything to make up for the US either withdrawing the executive order or simply not enforcing it. The EU has ventured into things that look a little bit like secondary sanctions. We can list third country entities involved in export control violations. We can now list financial institutions in third countries, and we should aggressively do that. But it's a very different animal than secondary sanctions, because every time you have to get over a certain evidentiary threshold that satisfies commission and council lawyers, and you have to get a unanimous decision in the council. And this could prove rather difficult. So since I'm running a little low on time, I'm going to go a little faster through this. So on the financial sanctions side, these sanctions haven't been incredibly effective anyway, largely because there are still exemptions, or there have been exemptions for many banks or some banks like Gazprom Bank for a serious amount of time. And we've never aggressively employed secondary sanctions, in this case, the US, to stop these banks from conducting cross-border transactions through financial centers elsewhere in the world. So should the US withdraw here, a lot of banks would still have to our banks would still have to comply with EU sanctions and couldn't just return to doing business with Russia. But it may make it easier for Russia and cheaper to conduct cross-border transactions. Briefly on SWIFT, this is an entity based in the European Union. The US has used political pressure on SWIFT before to disconnect Iranian banks. The idea is then, could it do the same to reconnect Russian banks? It could not, because SWIFT still has to comply with EU sanctions. So even if the US changed its position on this, the Russian banks would not be reconnected to SWIFT. On the immobilization of sovereign assets, most of it is in the EU. A very, very small share is in the US, and some of that is Euroclear money held in correspondent banking accounts. So just by the US alone could not really unfreeze a lot of our sanctions. There is, however, the question of prolongation of the sanctions and the asset freezes on the CBR and the NWF at the end of July and every 6 months. Sovereign debt sanctions, US investors foreign investors, as Torbjörn showed you earlier, have largely exited the market. The question is, could they return if the US removed some of these sanctions? A lot of them have also been around since before the full-scale invasion. The answer is probably no, because global asset managers and investors still have to comply with sanctions in other jurisdictions, including in the EU and the UK. Briefly on US dollar access, this is really the purview of the United States, so there's not a lot that we could do. And sanctions on US dollar access and the Moscow Stock Exchange have made it significantly harder and costlier for Russians to get access to foreign currency and to basically efficiently distribute the foreign currency in the system. Individual sanctions is green because I don't think individual sanctions matter for Russia's macroeconomic stability. That doesn't mean that there is no argument for why they should be there, but for the purposes of this analysis, we don't care too much. And on the trade sanctions side, again, the United States did not trade very much with Russia before the full-scale invasion. A lot of US imports from Russia were actually fossil fuels. By now, Russia is a competitor for the US in the global market for oil and gas, so I do not see very big prospects. And long story short, again, it is Europe that decides what we do here. The elephant in the room, and this is one I want to close with, is extraterritoriality. If you look at the color coding, everywhere here where extraterritorial sanctions application or enforcement is critical for its effectiveness, the shadow tanker designations, the export controls enforcement, this is where we would really struggle with the US withdrawing from the sanctions regime. So let me just leave it there and see if we have any questions, or rather if we have time for any questions.
Time keeping, and we have time for at least one question. If there is some now. Yes.
So I missed the slide where it says maintaining sanctions in the EU, because one thing that I keep getting questions about is how long can the EU maintain the current sanctions regime, with a growing number of Central and Eastern European countries becoming more skeptical towards providing support to Ukraine. And there's the whole issue of every 6 months, the EU sanctions regime has to renew sanctions. What happens if it's not renewed? Does that mean that EU, for example, control reverts of the reserves reverts back to Russia? We saw continued split in Poland. We have an election in Czechia in October where we might see government change. We have Hungary and Slovakia that are skeptical. So I was wondering if you talk a little bit about the cohesion within the EU. Thanks.
Yeah, happy to do that. So of course, this is a big challenge. I would say that the number of really obstructionist governments in the EU is one, and has been one for a while. The Slovak government likes to make a little bit of noise, but generally then gets in line. I also want to emphasize that despite all the kicking and screaming, Orban has agreed to every single sanctions package and every not ensured that this is going to remain the same. I think the EU is looking at ways to proceed with the sanctions regime that circumvent the unanimity issue in the Council. If you look at the roadmap that was put out to end imports of Russian fossil fuels to the EU, a lot of that is supposedly done under energy market regulations, trade measures, not under common foreign and security policy, which means it doesn't require unanimous decision. As for the assets, I think this is a very important topic. Theoretically, you're right. If the sanctions are not prolonged at the end of July, then the assets that are frozen in the European Union become available to Russia basically overnight. And this is not something, just to emphasize this is not something that we can ever accept to happen, right? The credibility of the entire sanctions regime would basically go out of the window if we allow Vladimir Putin to regain access to over 200 billion euros in frozen assets overnight. There's some media reporting that the EU is looking at alternative measures to keep these assets frozen outside of the narrowly defined sanctions regime, again with some kind of qualified majority vote. It's not entirely clear how. Maybe some banking regulations. The ultimate backstop is sanctions on or asset freezes on the national level, which are theoretically possible. I don't think the Belgians like this idea very much, but it is possible. And if things get properly bad, then this is something that we may need to look at. Of course, long story short, the question of EU cohesion on the sanctions regime is a big one. It's missing from here because it's a political problem that the other governments then need to figure out in Brussels, basically.
I am Erlend Bjørtvedt. I founded a country risk company called Corisk in Oslo a few years ago, after having worked 15 years for the Telenor Group as the head of country risk and other analytical assignments. Here am I at the border between Georgia and Russia in November. And as you all know, there was I was there as an electoral observer for the Norwegian Helsinki Committee, and then we also did some research, including going to the borders. You may remember that the election in Georgia was highly fraudulent. And it's interesting, even though this is not the full story, that after the EU effectively closed the Belarus gap and the Belarus border, the Belarus corridor of illegal trade from the EU to Russia, of course, Georgia became immensely more important to Russia because this is one of the few remaining land routes where sanctioned European goods can actually still flow through the customs. So that is also an aspect that we will come back to, how shadow trade is shifting between intermediary countries. First, just a little bit about us. We are not as well known as the site or other universities present here. But we have been basically, after Russia attacked Ukraine, we started basically drilling data and going deep into trade. And we have continued doing so for 3 years, issued quite a lot of reports. And Russia's foreign economy has become very much our kind of domain of interest. We contributed a little bit to one of the site reports commissioned by the Swedish government on Russia's economy. And our latest report was on Western circumvention via China and Hong Kong. We have been lucky to work with several governments, for example, the Finnish government, quite a lot, also explaining to the customs service how kind of circumvention goes on and where are the loopholes and what should they be most worried about. But today, we are going to say a bit about how to measure sanction evasion, because this will be a topic also when we launch the portal. At the bottom of the portal, when it comes to the indexing or benchmarking or measuring of sanction evasion, of course, will be the trade data and the estimate of evasion. We'll look a bit on data. We are applying Western data, but we're also applying Russian data, and a lot of scientists do that, including here Casey and others. Also kind of depending on Russian data. And what we're going to do today, we are also going to look a little bit into whether or not we can trust the Russian data. Do they concur with the Western data? And is there any value in kind of applying them in analysis? So we will also say a bit of how that can help validate our results, and then sum up with a bit of very headline or very top-down overview of how basically sanction evasion is developing. What are the trends? So just to say a bit about the data or the country coverage. So we have built some databases estimating sanction evasion at the national level. And apart from being able to measure the total Western sanction evasion, we can also granulate that into individual countries. This, of course, is very interesting both to many politicians and media. People want to know, how is my country doing compared to the other country? Is Sweden or Norway or Germany kind of are they improving on sanctioning Russia, etc.? And here are the countries for which we can go granular, which are most of the Western countries, and at the same time also for the intermediary countries, our database contains the granular data for most countries. So basically, this will also be an option in the portal that we can basically say something about which countries succeed in sanctioning and which succeed less. When it comes to the data, basically all trade data is in some way based on customs data. Basically, countries trade with each other, and someone at the border record what is being sold or bought. And at the bottom of it, it's mostly collected in the same way. Western export data, of course, is quite comprehensive, but not totally comprehensive. Then we have third country data like Turkish data, Georgian, Kazakhstani. They are surprisingly good and granular and precise and have a substantial coverage. When we're using Russian data, and the reason why we're doing that, because there you'll find both you'll find kind of proof that the goods actually ended in Russia, because you'll see them being imported. You will also find company names, all the Western company names. But the thing is that the main portion that is missing in those data is the internal trade within the Eurasian Economic Union. So it means, for example, trade between Belarus and Russia or Kazakhstan and Russia, you'll be missing most of that. So how we're basically doing this, how are we going to measure how much Western evasion of sanction there is regarding Russia sanctions? So one thing, you start at the very top, you start on with kind of total trade with Russia. You look at what Western countries report that they export to Russia. We will focus quite a lot of Western export here, not that much on import. That is well known already from KSC, from Russia when it comes to oil and gas, etc. But we will focus on export, and the reason for that is that in the end of the day, we want Russia not to import and receive a lot of war-critical technologies. And so basically, if you take war-critical technologies and import them from Russia, that is also illegal, but then you're only taking war-critical goods and away from Russia, right? So it's clearly and objectively much more serious that you actually sell Russia these goods. So we're looking at what Russia say that they import from the world, and we're looking at what the world says that it actually exports to Russia, and we can compare these two. But then the proof of the pudding, method number 2 here, is that we look at Western countries, how much do they export to typically Turkey, Kazakhstan, Belarus, Georgia, and those countries, typical stepping stone intermediary countries. We call them third countries, but those are the countries that sell the goods. They re-export them and pass them on to Russia. And we have a quite elaborate model to estimate that. And basically it means that, let's say Germany increase export to Armenia by 500%. then it's quite obvious that there is something going on here, right? And our model basically take those kind of trade data between Western countries and all of these intermediaries, this 14 that we showed, and it basically estimates how much of that is passed on to Russia. We will see later whether or not this concurs with Russian import data. Then, of course, you also have source number 3, Russian customs data. How much do they say that they import that are actually Western goods? So in the Russian customs database, you will actually find how many ball bearings or trucks or whatever did we import from Belgium. Basically find all the granularities, and then you can basically focus on Western reporting of how much Western goods they import, and you can compare that to the results of your own estimation model. And we will do this. And then you also actually have, so here you have like Russian reporting of how much Western goods they get from, for example, from Georgia. But then you can also go to Georgian trade statistics and you can see if this is correct. And Georgian trade statistics is actually very good, or at least very granular. So many, as you understand, we can validate results by triangulating many kind of sources, and we can see that we arrive at some reasonable. And we can granulate all of these down to the country, or disaggregate to the country level, commodity level, even company level, but we will certainly avoid that at this stage, and that is more for police than for scientists. So first, very top down, Russia's total trade. This is Russia's imports. We have a similar chart for exports. We don't show this today, but basically Russia's exports is falling from the peak around late 2022. It's been just falling. And what about Russia's imports? When you go to war, like Russia's done, they should naturally need to import more, because they need to import a lot of stuff that they use to produce weapons. And also many civilian industries are being crowded out and exchanged with military production. Then you'd also normally need to even import more normal goods as well. So here we are basically seeing the red line is what Russia central bank report that they import from the world total, about $20–30 billion a month. So this is the only trade statistics you basically get from Russia official. You just get the total, because after they attacked Ukraine, they stopped reporting the per country, because they didn't want to show who were basically supplying them. So what we did is that we went to the trade statistics, the export of 170 countries, basically all the economies that matter in the world. We are only missing some small Pacific island states, etc. And basically we look at how much did they say that they sold to Russia. And what you can see, especially before the attack on Ukraine, you can see a very good connect between those two lines, which means basically the Russian import data are probably correct. So the red line, what Russia pays, what Russia basically record that they import, is basically what they pay for the good. And then you see the green line, actually what the exporters outside of Russia say that they sell to Russia. And you can see the red line basically being kind of a bit above the green. And why? And that is because that difference is the import cost, because Russia also have to get these goods shipped to Russia. So basically, the green line, say you are Turkey, you sell to Russia and you charge a price, and that's the green line. But Russia pays more because they also have to pay for the shipping and all of that, and a logistic freight. And the difference between those two lines is the import cost. And that used to be only about 4% before the war. And immediately in 2022, you can see, for example, during the tax shock here in March, April, it jumped a lot. But basically, since the war, Russia's import cost has been around 11% in 2024, which is very, very high. That's at a level of landlocked African countries. So it basically means that Russia is paying more and more just to get the goods on board, and which don't give full value of, doesn't reflect fully the value of the goods, because a lot of more and more is shipping cost, which doesn't really give them anything. So does the import increase, or does Russian import decline? It's a bit kind of complicated. Should we look at the red line or should we look at the green line? Let's look at both. So what Russia pays, the red line, is stable, or even from 23 to 24, it's even a bit increasing. Now we are following the December spikes, but those are also actually the trend lines. But if you measure it in the actual value of the goods, including shipping, which doesn't bring them any good, you will see that there is a 15% nominal decline in Russia's imports. And this is nominal decline, and that's very important, because those goods that Russia import are becoming increasingly more and more expensive to Russia, because middlemen, be it in Turkey or Kyrgyzstan or wherever that is, they charge a premium, they charge that markup that Benjamin was talking about, because they take the risk, they have to smuggle, they have to bribe some customs officials, etc. So basically Russia pays more and more, but they get less, they get 15% less nominally, but in real terms, they get substantially less. So that is a reflection. Is that a reflection of the sanction? Yes, but is it a reflection on sanctions on Western export to Russia, or is it more a reflection of the sanction on Russian oil and export revenues, shadow fleet, financial, etc.? What we think, and after having studied this for several years, is that Russia can import according to how much they export. So if you reduce their export, you reduce their import. And this has some very logical reasons. Russia don't have any reserves that you usually use for import. If you don't have the money to import, usually you can use your reserves, or you can get trade credit from some other country. But both of these allies are increasingly closed. They don't have any reserves anymore, and it's increasingly risky for other countries to basically loan them money. So let's move on now to only Western goods, because these were global goods, global trade. Here is Western direct export of all kinds of goods to Russia. Again, the little tank here, that will always be marking the period of the second attack on Ukraine in February 22. And you can see this is clearly the effect of sanctions, right? Because it became illegal for Western countries to sell a lot of things to Russia. And you can see the Western direct exports, and by Western we mean all those 26 countries. This is basically, for all practical purposes, this is all the Western export. It went from typically $11 billion a month, and it's now $4 billion. So it's been reduced by almost 2/3. But this is only official trade, the official export of Western countries to Russia. So next question is, how much goods are Western countries exporting to Russia, but via some third country? And then we use that as kind of excessive trade estimation model, and we arrive here. And this gives quite a other picture. So this is also Western export to Russia, but the goods are first, for example, in Turkey or Georgia or Kazakhstan, and then they enter Russia. So this is still, we are only using Western data, direct trade with Russia and excessive direct export to Russia and excessive export to a third country. Let's see if this is correct. Well, let's try to validate it against Russian import data, which we can only get if we want to look at Western goods. We can only get that from the customs data, not from the central bank, but from the custom. And look at the graph for Russian imports of Western origin goods. It follows our estimate quite nicely, right? So you can see some spikes here, which are not very trustworthy. Why should they import 8 billion per month here and then 20 billion? This is because actually Russian import data is not the date when the goods enter Russia. It's the date when the Russian importer takes the good out of the custody of the Russian customs agency. So there can be some kind of, and there can be some temporal skews in the recording. But if you look at it quarterly and not to say annually, you will see a very good match. And here, after attack, you'll see a real good match. So this means that maybe our estimate was not so bad. And it also means that if we start from the viewpoint of our estimate, the customs data of Russia are also not so bad. They're quite comprehensive. Because if one were wrong, they would be more. There would be a bigger discrepancy. But from 2024, as everyone who worked with Russian customs data know, from 2024 they start to hide data. They start to not kind of give us data. They give us here about only half of the trades. And this is because they have started to realize that what all these people use this data for, they use it, of course, to pinpoint loopholes and to evaluate the progression and the success of sanctions. Now, this green field, this circumvention trade, which is basically Western export via some country, and because it goes via some country, we have reason to believe it's sanctioned goods. Otherwise, you could just send it directly to Russia. Let's look at that. This is our estimate of Western circumvention export to Russia, total, $2.5 billion a month, and more or less are they stable or even a bit increasing. So this is in some way a measure of the success of Western sanctions on exports of digital components, cars, ball bearings, all of those goods we don't want Russia to get. And we can see that in total and aggregate, they still buy as much Western goods via third countries as they did in 2022. But of course, the direct trade with Russia has decreased. So actually, their total supplies of Western goods, of course, have clearly decreased. They have been halved. But here we actually see that this is excessive Western export via 10 third countries, and it's quite substantial. But now, and we can use that. We can look at which countries we can boil this down to any country, to individual countries, but we can also do groups of countries. Here in the yellow in the bottom, we have Belarus. And in September 2024, Western circumvention via Belarus totally disappears. And the reason for that is that Finland, Lithuania, and Poland have totally closed their borders. First, Finland closed their border here, and then Lithuania here. And here, Poland was the last country, and that was because with the EU directive that harmonized Belarus and Russia sanctions in September 24, everything, all Western circumvention via Belarus stopped, and totally stopped. So that means that the EU closed the Belarus gap. They closed the Belarus route. There is virtually nothing going sanction going on via there. And that means that also brought a reduction in circumvention via, for example, Kyrgyzstan. Why? Just look at the map. If you're a German or Swedish producer and you want to send something to Kyrgyzstan, it goes naturally via Belarus and the Moscow area because it's far north. But if you want to bring it to more like Tajikistan, Uzbekistan, which is much further south, you will usually use the Bosporus route via Turkey. So what we see that when you close the Belarus gap, you got rid of all circumvention via Belarus, but also a lot of that via Kazakhstan and Kyrgyzstan. But Russians now get more and more via the Bosporus route and the Caucasus, which can explain also why they are so interested in Georgia. And United Arab Emirates are also increasing a lot. So we can granulate this, and that means that we can, via the index on the portal, we will be able, when we launch this, to say something about kind of where the routes, what works, etc. Now, again, let's validate it. We validate it against Russian data. We did that for the total, and we did it for the Western. And now we're going to validate a circumvention route. And we're going to take the typical Bosporus route plus the Emirates. And we're going to look at what the model says about Western circumvention. Basically, because the Belarus route was gradually being closed by the EU, we will see more and more Western circumvention going via Turkey, Uzbekistan, and Emirates, basically the Bosporus, physically via the Bosporus in some way. So this is the model's estimation of Western export to Russia via these countries, presumably generally sanctioned goods, because otherwise you would not have to send it all that detour around. And now we are going to look at what these countries say that they sell to Russia, their exports, but we're going to deduct their exports to Russia of the goods that they make themselves. That means we'll be left with a line telling us how much does Turkey, Uzbekistan, and Emirates sell to Russia that is foreign goods. Most of this will be Western goods, a bit Chinese, but generally, to all practical purpose, this will be most of it Western goods. And we get that line here. And what we see is that these countries, Turkey, Uzbekistan, and Emirates, before the war, they didn't re-export much foreign goods to Russia, hardly anything. So because there was no need to, because Germany, Sweden, Korea, they could just sell directly to Russia. But then you see a very good match, first of all, in the timing. This is basically Russia's increasing import of foreign goods from these three countries that were not produced in these three countries. And you can see a quite good match also with our estimate. Maybe our estimate is a bit low, but remember, basically we see that from this, that basically our estimate is kind of more or less in line with what is accounted as imported to Russia. And this also strengthens, I think, the validation of both sources, so to say. So a bit on summing up, again from the Georgia-Russian border, there was a lot of traffic there. It was the same at the Georgian-Azerbaijani border. First of all, we found that Western trade data do concur with Russian customs data and with Russian Bank of Russian data. Basically, mean you can probably trust those Russian data. Other Russian data you cannot trust, but also means that our estimates are not totally out of target. We see that Russia is importing less and less under rapidly increasing import costs. So the import costs, which is basically shipping and other things that you pay, but you don't get any more goods by paying it, have been trebled. The third is that the closing of the Belarus gap has resulted in longer evasion routes. More have to go via Bosporus or even further. And that increased the cost of Russia, but it also put some strains on European enforcement because it's more difficult to enforce on the Georgian border than it is on the Lithuanian border. Thank you very much.
sanctionsrussia.org. I will also show a QR code later that you can access directly. So this is the landing page, and here this is the dream team that helped contributed in various forms to this project. And here we have directly 4 big questions that are a little bit overarching and help set the stage for the entire resource. Along with these, the main categories of sanctions are introduced, broad brushes, their effect, their aims. This is to offer orientation from the start. It's not just a list of measures, but it's a way to put together the puzzle, how they fit together, how the pieces fit together. Then the portal is built around 3 main features, and it is a timeline of sanctions and countermeasures. And the research library or evidence base, which is really the core of this portal. And then we have the compliance index that is under development still. The development has been unfortunately delayed, but it's forthcoming in the fall, hopefully. And Erlend will talk more about this. So the timeline, as you see, this offers a structured view of the evolving sanction landscape. You have the Western sanctions on one side, and importantly, so there are other timelines of sanctions in other places. I think what is the contribution of this resource is the countermeasure timeline as well, which include not only formal retaliatory sanctions, but also domestic adaptation policies, like capital controls, trade rerouting, and import substitution strategies. All of them are, you can go in and read further details and find the sources for all of these resources. So a little bit of putting together the puzzle. And here you can sort them in chronological order or by sectors. And then the evidence base is the material is organized into main categories. We have the energy sector, the financial restriction, military production, trade restriction, and the others. And these reflect the main economic channels through which sanctions are designed to operate. The emphasis here is on academic rigor and credibility. These studies are both our own analysis and also externally research of high quality that have been carefully selected for their methodological soundness and relevance. And each is accompanied by a curated summary, all the references to the authors and the sources, and they're linked to each other. This is supposed to make the studies accessible, but without oversimplifying them. We also have a search function. So even if you're looking for something more specific than these broad categories, then you can do more specific searches, for example. And we hope to add in the future also a chatbot function, to be able to query directly the studies. So ask questions about what is the content of the studies. And finally, the compliance index, which is, well, Erlend created a lot of expectations around this. It has already raised a lot of interest from media, politicians. We know, as Erlend says, everybody wants to know, how is my country doing? How do we rank compared to others? So unfortunately, this is still here a placeholder for the index that will be there. The data will be here. There will be functionalities for visualizing the data, ranking countries, comparing over time, maps, and so on. For now, users can register to receive updates for when the index will be online. So now I've done my quick tour of the index of this portal, and I will let Erlend come back to talk a little bit more about the substance of the index.
Thank you.
5 more minutes, and then we have some time for
5
discussion.
more minutes. Thank
yes,
you.
we're a little bit short on time. Oh, you have
yeah,
the mic.
I have. I think maybe there is a presentation, but I don't know if we can. So basically, just going to say a little bit on, we developed this idea over last year, and we are happy. No, yeah, okay. Exactly, yes. Yes, just say a little bit about how we will construct this. With 5 minutes is a bit short of time to go into details, but basically this will be a tool for policymakers, customs officials, everyone who are working with policy development, enforcement, etc., in just the same way as we have already assisted, for example, customs agencies of Finland and Poland with data. So basically, what and who to measure, classification of goods. So basically, we are going to look at, first, we're going to look at the sanction, the circumvention, or let's say each country's kind of ability to comply with the sanctions, or basically on the opposite, each country's partaking in sanction evasion. We can quantify that. We saw that in the previous presentation. We can quantify that in many ways down to the country level. But we're also going to look at legal enforcement and corporate compliance metrics and see if there is correlation or even causality between them and sanction evasion. So correlation and causality are different things. Most violent people are men, but they are not violent because they are men. So there's a correlation, but it's not a full causality, right? So we are only looking now at basically correlation. But basically, from the countries that we showed, it is a lot of work to kind of do this for all countries. So on the Western side, and because that is most important to Russia's warfare, and we are looking at most of these countries. This is in the first version, at least, also including Sweden. And we are looking at 8 third countries. There are some methodological problems, for example, with Azerbaijan, because they also have a lot of circumvention trade on behalf of Iran. So there are some countries which are more tricky, and maybe will be in next round. The goods. We are looking a bit on imports, just some Western imports of some Russian goods that are a bit randomly, this is a bit randomly chosen, but the thing about all these goods is that they have been sanctioned for a long time, mostly since April or July 22. So it makes sense to follow trade on them over time because they've been sanctioned all the time. So if they were only sanctioned last week, then it wouldn't make so much sense because trade in them historically then would be illegal. So basically some import goods, we're looking at automotive. We will look at certainly on automotive because that's extremely important to Russia's warfare. Logistics is key to the warfare. And one of the we showed how import is declining, but one of the goods that Russia is prioritizing and that they're importing more and more of, that is trucks. And then we're going to look at war-relevant goods that arrive from Western countries and even war-critical, like these CNC machines, like tools for metal making, of course, semiconductors, etc. Many of these are critical goods. So basically, this is work in progress, but this is a logical way of dividing it, and it's also goods that have been sanctioned for a long time. Just to so version 1.0, we ran this model on these goods, these kinds of goods, and we looked here at individual countries. We look at intermediary countries. We do not look at the Western countries like Sweden versus Finland and Germany, etc. At least not yet, because then we want to be more sure that our data are correct and valid and solid. But here is typically first on the left column, how much circumvention Western goods to Russia do we think these countries facilitated? Turkey in a league of itself. We don't have Emirates here, we can add Emirates. Kazakhstan, yes, but that doesn't mean that the goods actually go first to Kazakhstan and then to Russia. This is more kind of typical Russian or Belarusian business people set up a company in Kazakhstan. They bring German or Swedish goods to somewhere at the border, and they basically sell they say in the shipment papers, this is going to Kazakhstan, and then some mysterious way it falls off the lorry somewhere around Moscow. So basically, but for Turkey, facilitation of circumvention trade will generally mean that the goods are actually also going via Turkey, because that was what we saw in the previous presentation, that the Bosporus route is becoming more and more important. And then we have relevant trade. Relative trade means that, yes, Turkey is facilitating a lot of circumvention, but relative to their total trade with Russia and their total economy and their total trade, it's still something, but it's not very, very big. While for Tajikistan, we facilitated a lot less circumvention trade, but to their economy, which is very, very small, this was much more important. And then we can see also, we can look at, for example, the most war-relevant goods, and you can see that Turkey is quite important in getting those goods to Russia, Tajikistan not so much. So basically they're facilitating less war-relevant goods, but still sanctioned. And then we can look here at the change in 2024, for example, is there improvement? And we'll basically see that Tajikistan is definitely the new kid on the block in facilitating circumvention for the Russian supplies, whereas Armenia, Kazakhstan, and Kyrgyzstan are doing substantially less of that in 24 compared to 20. So there is kind of improvement. Some of the correlation, this is very preliminary, and this is only kind of a univariate. This is only correlation between A and B factors, basically correlation between sanction performance and some characteristics, regulatory or political legal characteristics. This is what will develop war into. But we had, for example, I think very important, Sweden is raising the maximum penalty. You're also going to implement the Worm directive from the EU. Basically, you'll have to include or introduce criminal neglect or strict liability in Swedish law, which is not there from before. It is in Norwegian and Danish law, but not in Finnish and Swedish from before. So basically, we looked here at, was it 17 Western countries, and what was correlated. And we see that, and this is quite strong, the standard deviation is quite high, good spread. There is no correlation between long prison time and better performance on sanction evasion. That doesn't mean that you should not raise the necessarily, but because again, this is correlation and not causality, as with kind of violence and man. So there's correlation, yes, but we will go deeper down. But many convictions and fines, very strong correlation, very, very strong. So those countries that have done a lot of investigation and have persecuted a lot of companies, like Finland, for example, they are performing much better than those countries that haven't. Corruption, of course, is very clear correlation in the intermediary countries. Whereas, and the same with customs, quality of customs service, that correlation is not so strong in the Western countries, maybe because customs service is quite reasonably good all over. So that was basically just a little glimpse of what is to come, and we're looking forward to deliver that together.
Yes, we definitely look forward. Thank you, Erlend. Again, I'm going to take a tough decision now and delay your lunch, but by some minutes, so that you have the opportunity to ask some questions now. We have one here already.
Thank you. My name is Heinz Sjögren. I am CEO of the Swedish Chamber of Commerce for Eurasia. And I thank you, Erlend, for this very impressive data collection model, it seemed to me. I had two questions, actually. You presented in the beginning a graph of the direct trade with Russia before February 22. Did you take into account that quite some export to Russia actually went further to the Eastern countries, for instance, which now is maybe countered a little bit by direct sales to the Eastern countries or Georgia and so on? That was one question. The other one was actually, have you made any attempt or thinking of actually trying to trace the payments? Because payments and the money flow might be telling even more of a picture than the direct flow, so to say. I understand it might be a little bit more difficult, of course, due to banking secrets and so on. But have you also found, are there any changes in currencies used? I mean, we see India, China, and so on. And we also know that sanctions can be hitting US dollar payments, for instance. So maybe more than two questions, sorry.
Very short on the first partly. So we have not looked at whether some of the Western export to Russia was then Russia was a hub and then reselling to Kazakhstan. That could well happen. And for example, Mercedes-Benz had production in Moscow. So then they didn't import those cars. They actually were made in Russia. They were maybe distributed to Kazakhstan or somewhere. So that would be very tricky to track all of that. But what we have made sure is that when we look at excessive Western export to a country like Kazakhstan, we have made sure that that excessive export is not just something that was formerly Russian export to Kazakhstan, that kind of replaced that. So we have to make sure that, for example, Kazakhstan is in total importing more, because otherwise the Western excessive goods would not be excessive. They would just be kind of filling the gap from Russia. So all of this has been, of course, cleared out. When it comes to payments, so the Russian central bank total import data and all of those balance of payment data, that is balance of payment data. But apart from that, we haven't found good sources on tracking the payment, the transaction part of trade involving Russia for obvious reasons. That is, now with banking, sanctions, all of that, I think a good challenge, but complicated. And the third question was about
other currencies?
Yes, we have looked at that. That is very, very good question. We have looked quite a lot of that. We look at many things. First, in 10 seconds, we presented to Atlantic Council and we looked at the price that Russia charges for oil. And we found that they are not giving a rebate to China, but they are giving to India, Slovakia, Hungary, and Belarus, but they are not giving to China, Czech Republic, etc. So just a little comment on how we're using granular data to also validate, is there a kind of China-Russia alliance? We see very little of that in the data, but we saw, but when it comes to currencies as such, unfortunately, the good news is that when Russia buys, let's say, digital components, they have to pay it in euro or dollar. When they buy the really critical, valuable things. Why? Because along that circumvention value chain, supply chain, no one wants to take the currency risk. So basically, just like oil, in the end of the day, you have to pay everything also at the end in the same. So they need dollars to import a lot of the important things. That is also one reason why they can only import what they export, because actually they need to first acquire the dollars. What we also saw, unfortunately, that many European countries, when they import from Russia, for example, fertilizer or what, they pay Russia in hard currency, maybe for some mundane reason, but that is certainly also supplies Russia with hard currency. Of course, oil trade is mostly in dollar, so they do get some, but I think restricting their access to hard currency could be maybe a way, at least on the marginal, to curtail some of their critical imports as well. So we looked a bit on that, and that is also why financial and other sanctions spill over on the sanction on goods and technologies. Thank you.
We take one more question here. We try to keep it short, and then keep in mind that there is a lunch, and you are very welcome to continue the discussion at the lunch.
My name is Hans-Gunnar Adén. I used to work at the Ministry for Foreign Affairs here in Stockholm. You mentioned that the West has succeeded in closing the Belarus gap, as you called it. And you said that there is now a shift to the east, and you mentioned that that is a challenge for us here in the West to try to do a similar thing, to close that gap. Do we have any policy tools? I mean, geography is different than Belarus. Can you elaborate a little about how can we go about this challenge?
Benjamin Hilgenstock already touched a lot upon that. Extraterritorial secondary sanctions, for example. So basically, for example, Georgia, because if you take goods via Turkey, if you don't put them on ship from Istanbul, they basically go the roadway. And for example, we use road data to check this as well. And basically, Georgia, for example, now is basically one reason why Putin is aligning, and they are aligning more with Putin. One is to whitewash all the money that Ivanishvili want to take back to Georgia. So that is one thing. But another reason is probably that this is one of the few, this is the last remaining land bridge for illegal goods, sanctioned goods, to enter into Russia, unless we want to take it all the way via China, and because you cannot go via Afghanistan, and there are many routes that are basically closed. So yeah, you had Belarus, now you have Turkey, Georgia, which is the big kind of route, and otherwise you have to bring it to Russia some very, very long way, and that is also happening. So European countries, for example, they circumvent more and more even via China. You can even see quite heavy, big things made in Europe actually arriving at Russia via China. But the more we can kind of use extraterritorial secondary sanctions, I think would be one way to kind of put pressure on those intermediary countries.
Excellent. Once again, please continue the discussion over lunch. I will close now with some more thank you and an invitation. So first of all, a huge thanks to our speakers. It's been a fantastic morning. How privileged we are to have been able to share all of these insights. Thank you for being with us. A huge thanks to the ministry for being here and for supporting us, and more broadly for their commitment to upholding sanctions. About the portal, this has been a collaborative effort, and I want to warmly thank the web development team, fantastic, that are listening to us from the Ether. They built a platform both functional and elegant, and the research assistants, also here somewhere, whose work was essential in gathering and shaping the content. Now the invitation, this portal is made to be used. It's a resource for all that want to understand sanctions better, policymakers, journalists, researchers, and engaged citizens. So I encourage you to explore it, share it, and engage with it. Sanctions are a long game, and transparency is our best chance of staying in it. So with realism, coordination, and accountability. Thank you all, and welcome to lunch.